Hey, Van, would you come stand in front of the camera for a minute? Would you come around and stand in front of the camera? Come stand in front of the camera.
Oh, that's the camera. We're about similar size.
Yep. You do what I was doing. All right, thank you, Van.
We're heavy coats, these are heavy coats. What needs to be accessible? So what you're saying is you need to decide what we should protect from AI.
Well, I was given a computer that I thought was looking wonderful. It was an Apple. Not very
Laptop and she's used to.
Yeah.
Very different.
Rob, we're going to put this on you. We've got a couple of seconds and. Testing. John said it was on.
John will, did you hear John will introduce him? John will introduce him.
Excellent. I totally forgot.
Well, I said I would, I mean, I said to myself I would, and then I thought.
No, I may need your help to make sure I got it so that.
I never know how these things go. Well, this thing's got to go on your face and your mouth. That's probably. Okay, so try it.
My words on my ear.
No, I think that
Morning, everybody. Hello, everybody. Those coming in. Everybody comes in and hugs my son. That's very nice. I have a friend at the Pines who every morning sends me a different question. Sometimes they're fact questions that I don't know the answers to, and others are opinion questions. And today he said, who is somebody that gives a bright light in a dark world for you? And his answer was Dawn Staley, the coach of the University of South Carolina basketball team, women's team. I thought my person is Rob Spach. Rob Spach graduated from Davidson just weeks before we moved here. He got out just in time. Went off to study literature at the University of Virginia for a while. Then went to Portugal to teach school for a while. Came back and went to Princeton Theological Seminary. And as soon as he finished that, Will Terry, with my help, had the good fortune to persuade him to come to Davidson as our chaplain. And Rob came. And Rob served as chaplain for 30 years. And Rob has just recently retired from that job, having done one of the most remarkable jobs of any chaplain that I've ever heard of, and certainly has done a wonderful job for Davidson in terms of setting the spirit of this institution. Rob's going to tell you a story this morning that Missy and I heard 25 years ago at least, and I've tried to tell it about 25 times since then, and I want to hear what the real story is. So, Rob, thank you for coming today. We appreciate having you.
John, thank you so much. It's so good to be with everybody. Thank you all so much for being here. I will say one word. So John's right. I got out just weeks before he arrived, just in time. But I came back while he was still president. So it wasn't him that scared me off. It was the magnet of UVA calling me. But I was really, I feel really privileged and honored to have spent those years as chaplain while he was still president. And have always been grateful to John and Missy for the incredible welcome that they gave me then, and that they continue, the way that they continue to support me through all my years. So thank you all so much. Really deeply important to me. I'd like us to begin with a word of prayer if we could. So let's pray together. Gracious God, you who meet us in the busyness of life and in the quiet of the depths of our own hearts, we thank you for this time together. We pray that your Spirit would be at work among us as I have this opportunity to share stories that deeply shaped my own life and my own faith. And we pray that this time might be to your glory. We lift this prayer in the strength of your Holy Spirit, in the name of Jesus. Amen. So I've been asked to talk about one main thing and then one side thing. So the main thing that I've been asked to share, can everybody hear me okay? Let me just double check that. Yeah, okay. The main thing I've been asked to share centers on my father's experiences during the Second World War, which ended up being pivotal to the trajectory of his life. And the trajectory of his life ended up being pivotal to my own development as a person of faith, the sensibilities that I ended up bringing to Davidson when I came here as the chaplain. So I'm going to spend most of my time talking about my dad, but then I'll spend a little bit of time talking about how his journey has shaped my journey. And then we go till, let me just double check, are we going till 10:30?
10:45.
Okay, so I'll be sure to leave some time for questions in case anyone has questions towards the end. So the year was 1944, August, and my father, Jules Spach, was 20 years old. He was about to have his 21st birthday, and he had become the pilot of a B-24 bomber. Now, I imagine our students today that I walk around with, and I'm imagining them being a pilot of a B-24 bomber, commanding a crew of 9 others, in this airplane, huge airplane. But that was what he found himself in, and he was on a mission with a large group of American bombers to the city of Genoa. There was a big munitions factory in Genoa. And so they were supposed to drop bombs on this munitions factory in Genoa. And so they were all flying in formation. And as they were going along, of course, they were over the Mediterranean. They had left from North Africa, and they were over the Mediterranean. And the right 2 engines on his plane suddenly died. They just weren't getting whatever they needed in terms of oil or whatever it was, and they just puttered out. So he only had 2 engines left. And he realized there was no way that he and his airplane and his crew were going to make it to Genoa to complete the bombing raid. And so he said, well, we got to turn around here and find some place to land. So they turned around, and they were heading back, and the other 2 engines went out. So suddenly he was piloting a plane that could only do one thing, which was glide down. There was no other option. And so he could see the Italian coast and decided he was going to try to make an emergency landing somewhere on the coast if he could find anywhere to land. So he directed the plane in that sort of direction to head towards the land. And they kept losing altitude, And he realized they weren't going to make it as far as the land. There was no chance. And so he told the rest of his crew to bail out, to parachute out over the Mediterranean. And his co-pilot, as his last thing that he did before he bailed out, was he sent out a mayday. Mayday, mayday. And then he bailed out, and then my dad was the last one strapped on his parachute, and he bailed out. Well, of course, the plane is still moving quickly. It's just moving down. So as they bailed out, they really ended up very, very far away from one another. So my dad was by himself, floating down in this parachute into the Mediterranean. And he lands in the Mediterranean Sea, and he gets his parachute off, and he realizes he's got on these heavy boots, and they start filling with water. So he's got to get those off. He manages to put his head under the water and manage to get his boots off. And then suddenly the fighter planes that had received the mayday arrive, and they're trying to see how they can help anybody. So they're flying lower to the water. Well, there's this cliff, this promontory basically, where the German gunners had been firing up at airplanes. But when these fighter planes start coming low, the guns fire down, right? And suddenly bullets are pouring into the water all around my father. Literally, I mean, as far away as you all are from me, there were just bullets spraying in. And he realized that within seconds he would be dead. And he had no concept of living. And as you can imagine, he was terrified. And he knew it was over. And so he had not ever been a particularly religious person. Spirituality had not mattered to him. He was kind of a hellraiser, and the kind of person that would on training, when he had a practice run with one of his airplanes as he was training, for him it was fun to all his friends were at R.J. Reynolds High School in Winston-Salem. And so he buzzed them all. He came down really close to where they were, gave them all a thrill. He was a guy that liked to have fun, good-natured, but religion was just of no interest whatsoever. But he'd been brought up by a grandfather who was a faithful Methodist. So he'd heard a little bit about God and about Scripture. So as he was about to die, and as he was frantic with fear, he just let out this prayer saying, God, I'm about to die. When I'm dead, have mercy on me, because it's all over for me. And that's all. He didn't say, let me live or anything like that. He just said, it's all over. So just have mercy on me when I'm dead. The fighter planes, shortly after that, realized they weren't going to be able to help anybody. So they lifted up and took off. And when they did that, of course, all the machine gunning stopped. And in the midst of his frantic fear, everything became quiet. And he suddenly experienced, in a way that sort of transformed his understanding of reality, a presence. He felt a presence with him. Like he knew in his bones that he wasn't alone. He didn't know exactly what that meant, but he just knew that like he wasn't alone. And he felt at peace. So he went from this moment of sort of frantic fear to a sense of peace and a sense of not being alone. And then he kind of out of that sort of looked at his situation, trying to decide what to do. And there weren't really great options at that point. He decided that like he could see the land in the distance. And so he might as well swim towards the land. So everything was weighing him down, his jacket, his big heavy trousers. So he took off all of his clothes except his underwear. And he decided the two things he wanted to keep were his watch and his wallet. You don't want to get rid of your money. He'd just been paid. He had all his money in his wallet. So he tried to swim along with his watch and his wallet towards the shore. And he realized pretty quickly that was probably going to cost him his life, not using his hands to swim. So he said one by one, he took out the money from his wallet and tossed the bills into the ocean, very ceremoniously. And then he tossed the wallet, stuck the watch and just hoped it would survive all the water, stuck it on his arm, and he just started swimming. And he swam and he swam. He swam for 6 hours. And by that time, it was late in the day. It wasn't dark yet, but it was late in the day, and he was exhausted. So he pulled himself up onto the beach there, and he saw a small cave. So he went into the cave, and he rested in the cave for a little while and considered, okay, what do I do now? So he could see down the beach, and down the beach he saw a little hut, and he saw a man sitting on a porch on this hut. So he said, well, maybe he would help me. So he took off his underwear, which were white, and he walked towards the man, like waving his white underwear, And the man looked at him, as one might imagine he would, and then went into the little hut, and he came out with a rifle. And he pointed the rifle towards my dad. So my dad realized, oh, this isn't a very good situation. So he went running away from the guy, down the beach, away from the guy, trying to put on his underwear at the same time. And he had no choice but to get back in the water. And I mentioned there was this promontory. So there was water on one side, and then this cliff stuck way out into the water, just sheer cliff. That's where his plane had crashed, actually. He'd seen it crash into that. And then there was a beach on the other side. So he decided, okay, I got to get back in the water. I got to swim to the other beach because this is not working. So he did. He had to swim 3 more hours. And by then it was dark. And when he reached that other beach on the other side, you can imagine now he was really exhausted. And so he crawled up onto the beach, and he kind of crawled as far as he could. And then he just basically collapsed. The next morning, when it was light, he heard these voices above him speaking. And so he kind of opened his eyes, and there were 2 middle-aged Italian peasant women looking at him. And they realized, this guy's in big trouble, They didn't know exactly what had happened, but they knew he was in trouble. So they tried to communicate with their hands, and he tried to communicate with his hands, and they weren't communicating very well, but they were harvesting grapes, and they had some grapes in their arms. And so he pointed at the grapes because he'd been in salt water for almost 10 hours, and he was desperately thirsty. So they offered him some grapes. Oh, heaven on earth. Right? He just ate all the grapes they could give him. And then they managed to communicate to him that they lived in a little village that was up at the top of this kind of basically side of a mountain. And there were terraces of grapes that were growing. And so they communicated to them that one of them would go ahead and look to see if there were any soldiers visible. And if not, would give my dad and the other woman a signal. And they would run across that terrace and then hide again. And then the woman would go across the next terrace and check. So they spent literally all day moving up the terraces that way until they finally got him to their village. And it was one woman walking in front of him, my dad, and then the other woman. And suddenly, a bunch of the villagers that lived there came out towards them. And they surrounded them so that my father was kind of lost in the midst of this crowd. And they walked him on into the village. And one of the women was intending to hide him in the basement of her house. Unfortunately, one of the women had a cousin who happened to be a fascist. And so he saw a great opportunity for himself. And so he got a gun and got my father and held him at gunpoint, notified the authorities. And so the Germans rolled in to get my father and take him away as a POW. And as they did, they got my father and they yelled at everyone in the village to come out so that they could sort of excoriate them for helping this POW, this man who was from the other side. And the two women that had actually really helped him were loaded onto a truck and they were taken away. Last my dad saw, off they go. And there was a little 5-year-old boy who was terrified with all these, soldiers with guns yelling at them. And so he started running away because he was scared. And one of the soldiers just, bam, shot him right in the back. And down he went. So my dad was loaded into a truck and he was taken to this hut. And 3 of his fellow airmen were in that hut. They had been captured as well. The other 6 had all died. Either died as they were coming down or drowned or had been shot because there were boats that the fascists would send out. And if they saw an enemy swimming along, they would just shoot them in the water. Okay, so that's kind of the beginning of the story. My father ends up being sent to a prisoner of war camp in Poland. And he can't stop thinking about this presence that he felt when he was in the water, and he didn't know what to make of it. Now, I just want to pause here and say the fact that it was a sense of a presence that had transformed my father's life and his way of understanding reality ended up being really important to me, because faith was never about sort of arguing people to a particular set of beliefs. Faith was not about like doing good things because God is going to judge you. What I heard growing up is about a presence that's with us, that we can't understand, but that's with us, and that we don't feel all the time, but it's real. So that, I just have to say, like I have to pause and say, that formed my own faith really deeply. And it shaped how I ended up sort of thinking about what was most important to me in my own spiritual life. So my father's in this POW camp and he can't stop thinking about that experience in the water. And so he decides to go to the chaplain who's there in the POW camp. Now this is a Scottish Presbyterian minister named Murdo MacDonald, who had been offered by the Germans to go back to Scotland because he was a clergy person, And he said to the Germans, no, this is my congregation, the POWs. And so I'm going to stay here with my congregation. which I've always thought was a remarkable thing. And so my dad got to talking to Murdo McDonald about that experience and began to think of it in terms of God and in terms of the Christian faith specifically, because that was Murdo McDonald's faith, and that's what my grandfather's faith had been. And that set him on a trajectory of looking at the world in a way that included the idea that there is a God and that God is present to us and that we can be present to that God with our lives. Okay, I'm going to fast forward. My father ended up, as you might imagine, having some really difficult experiences in the POW camp. The worst part was when the Germans were clearly losing the war. And so what they did was they moved all of the men that were in their various the POW camps, into one enormous POW camp. And in order to do that, it was the middle of winter. They had to march the POWs from their various camps to where there were railroads, and then they would put them in rail cars and take them to where the huge POW camp is. And so my father and all the other POWs in his particular camp set out on a march in the middle of winter with, it's not like we were talking earlier about thick coats and things. It's not like that, any of that. They were just marching along. And it was freezing. And the weaker of the men would just fall down in the snow, exhausted, malnourished. And at first, they would stop and they'd help each other up and keep going. But after a while, after hours of marching, my dad said, you realize that if you stopped to pick up this guy who had fallen, you weren't going to be able to get up yourself. The only thing you could do was think about putting one foot in front of the other foot, in front of the other foot, in front of the other foot. That's all you could concentrate on if you were going to survive. And so they marched for a couple of days in this situation. And they called it a death march because so many men died along the way. They got them to the rail car, and they were like the cattle cars, and they didn't have windows. They had one opening about this big at one end of the cattle car. And they made about 60 men fit into one cattle car for 3 days. And the doors didn't get open for 3 days. Now, you can imagine, if you let your imagination go at all, you can imagine what that was like. They were so tightly packed in there that they couldn't sit down or lie down. And so one guy would lie down and the other guys would straddle him. And he'd be able to lie there for a little while, and then they'd help him up, and the next one would lie down, and the guy would straddle him. I only saw my dad get really emotional about the war one time in my life. And that was when we were watching, y'all would, like me, you're old enough to remember it. There was this miniseries called Shoah that was on television back in the 70s. And there was a scene in which Jews were being loaded onto the cattle cars to be taken to the concentration camp. My dad had to leave the room. It was the only time I saw him just get completely overwhelmed. He said the 3 days in that cattle car were the most horrible 3 days he had ever been through. And when they finally got to where the huge camp was going to be and they opened the doors, he said they crawled out and they just felt less than human. They were just on all fours. They hadn't eaten in 3 days. They hadn't drunk in 3 days. They were filthy. They just felt not human. So all this is to say, while my dad's faith in God is growing and developing, it's not because God makes everything right for us or anything like that. It's not like God takes away the suffering. life is life, you know, and having a relationship with the divine isn't about like all your life being great. It's about living through the reality of our lives, which are wonderful and terrible, but not being alone, knowing you're not alone in a deep way. So anyway, I'll wrap this part of the story up. It was a prison camp. Once all the guys had been brought there, 100,000 prisoners in that one prison camp, 100,000 men, and one woman. One woman. She'd been a pilot of a Russian plane that had crashed. And to protect her, literally, the Nazis put her in a cage to protect her from all the men that were there. So she lived in a cage right in the middle of all these guys, just unbelievable. Patton's troops eventually came through as they were like winning the war. My dad said that when they reached that camp, he was probably about as far from Patton as, say, the building that's just behind us. So he could see Patton. And he said Patton was standing on top of a tank and looking out over this sea, a huge sea of miserable humanity. And he could see Patton's, the tears just going down his cheeks at what he was looking at. So my dad was, he made it back to the U.S. and he decided to become an electrical mechanical engineer. And so he went to Georgia Tech, great place to get those skills. And he was home one year, one of those years, visiting in Winston-Salem. And his best friend was this guy named Feathers Cunningham. And Feathers invited my dad to go out on a double date. So it'd be Feathers and his girlfriend and my dad and his girlfriend. And so they went on this double date. And Feathers' girlfriend was this woman named Nancy. Well, my dad really liked his own girlfriend, but Nancy, she was really interesting. And they got to talking, and he was asking her about herself, and she said, well, ever since I was 12, I wanted to be a missionary. And my dad was like, oh, that's interesting. Okay, whatever. So they had a great time talking, and the double date ended. My dad went back to Atlanta, and he's walking down the street in Atlanta a few weeks later. And this voice pops into his head, and it says, Jewel Spach, you should be a missionary. And he's like, wow, that's a crazy idea. Like, I'm not that interested in religion, first of all, and never thought of, missionary, that's crazy. Why would I do that? And I'm certainly not studying religion. I don't want to study religion and have to go tell people about, religion. I'm an engineer. But he couldn't get the thought out of his head, so the only person he knew that knew anything about missions was this Nancy. So he calls her up and he says, I'm heading up to Winston soon. Could we just sit down and talk about this thing that you've been interested in since you were 12? So they sat down, they talked, and she explained to him her understanding. My mom was an amazing person. I got to say that. And again, her way of sort of living out faith. I don't think I ever saw my mother judge anybody. Ever. I just saw in her a kind of love that was just expansive. And a purity of heart that I've never encountered again. And so here's my dad talking to this amazing woman. Well, as you can imagine, he starts to fall for her, right? So they start dating. Feathers kind of, his best friend Feathers kind of says, okay, you guys are better together than I am, so you go for it, Joel. All right. So just fantastic stories I could tell, but I'm going to skip over it. They get married, and my father's mother, very high socialite, in Winston-Salem wants her son to stick around. He's been gone in the war. She's missed him all this time. She wants him around. So he and my mom put this idea of being missionaries on the back burner, and he gets a job in engineering in Winston-Salem, and he is miserable. And so after about 2 years, his mom sits them down and says, Joe, you're not happy, are you? He's like, I'm not. She says, you two feel like you really feel called to be missionaries, don't you? And they both nod. And she says, well, I give you my blessing. So then you got to figure out, well, what are you going to do as missionaries? Because my dad is not a pastor. He is not interested in studying religion, but his faith has become really important to him, especially as he's gotten to know my mother, for whom it is like the core of life. So they go, he was brought up Methodist. So they go to the Methodists and they say, we'd like to be missionaries. Do you have a position for us? And the Methodists are like, well, not really, not with your particular skill set. So my mom had been Presbyterian, so they go to the Presbyterians, and the Presbyterians say, yeah, absolutely we do. There's a little school in Brazil that needs someone to teach math and science. Would you be up for doing that? So sure enough, that's what they ended up doing. They went to Brazil, and my dad became a math and science teacher at this little Presbyterian school. And their mission work was about education. It was about affirming the dignity of every person. It was about communicating God's love. Even to people they didn't get along with in certain ways. This was Brazil in the 1950s. And there were a lot of tensions between Catholics and Protestants. And both sides did bad things to the other at different points. But it's interesting, though my father had things directly done to him and to his friends by people who are Catholic, I never heard him say a bad word about Catholics my whole life. Never. I think he saw beyond it. He saw something, beyond that connected him to people, beyond the differences. Well, I'd say that's pivotal to my own faith. And I'd say I got that from them. My dad always said, you can disagree with people, really disagree with them, and you can still respect them. You can still care about them. You don't have to agree in order to really care about people and honor and respect them. And I think that was one of the lessons that I took away as a young man that has shaped everything I've done since then. All right, I'm going to tell a quick story about my dad that I can't leave out, and then I'll spend a few minutes about myself and my own my own journey. So you remember it was 1944 when my dad was shot down. The two women rescued him, took him up to this village, and then he was taken away. So in his work in Brazil, he had eventually gotten involved with a bunch of Brazilian political leaders doing work, bringing together leaders across different political traditions based on a common faith, with the intent being, what can we do that would be good for the Brazilian people, including in education, which was my dad's particular field. And so they had gotten this thing working pretty well, where people from on different sides of the political aisle were joining together and out of their faith figuring out, okay, these are things that we agree on that we can do that are good for the Brazilian people. And so they decided to take this show on the road because it was working so well. And that meant going as a group to various countries in Europe and sharing with folks what they were doing in Brazil as a model. And so one of the places that they got to go was Italy. And my dad hadn't been back since 1944. And he had one day that was free that everybody else in the group was busy doing something else. And he had one day that he didn't really have to be with them. And so he said, I want to go see if I can find that village. So they said, well, absolutely, go for it. So he went to this bigger city of La Spezia, which he knew had been near where he had crash landed. And he rented a car and he started driving through the hills. I mean, it was a wild idea that he could find it because he knew nothing, and about any details. So anyway, he's driving along, he's going up this hill. He hadn't seen anything that he knows and suddenly his whole body starts shaking. And he's like, he has to pull over to the side of the road. He's like, why? What's going on? He has no idea. So he gets back in the car, and as he crests the hill, there's the bay where he was shot down, where he had to bail out. And so he knows he's in the right general area. His body knew it before his conscious mind did. Looks and looks, and finally it's getting late in the day. He stops in this little restaurant. There are these 4 guys in their 20s, and they are sitting around a table playing cards, drinking. And he comes up to them, and one of them speaks English, and he says, I was shot down here. The year is now 1973. He says, I was shot down here, back in the mid-40s, and I'm looking for a village because these 2 ladies lived in it, and they helped me. And the guy was like, there are lots of villages around here. We have no idea what you're talking about. There's one that you could check out that's just straight down this road. And he's like, I don't think it was that because that was, not up high in the mountain. But he said, I'll just go look at it. So he leaves, drives down there. It's clearly not the village. You can't figure out. He's like, okay, well, I gave it my best shot. And he's looking out at the bay one more time. And suddenly he notices black cars flying down the road. He's like, whoa, they're going way too fast. Well, they come right beside him and park, and 2 men jump out. And one of them is this elderly guy who is probably in his 70s at this point, maybe his early 80s. And he is just going off in Italian. And my dad's like, what in the world? And Italian. And then he says, and my dad gets it. He saw my dad get shot down. And this man keeps saying this word, Campiglia, Campiglia, Campiglia. So my dad says, Campiglia? Oh, the man is so happy. He grabs my dad and kisses him. And he goes, what in the world? And then he figured it out. The town is Campiglia. So this elderly guy, it turns out, was the owner of the restaurant where my dad stopped. He had been in the kitchen while my dad was talking to the 4 guys. And he'd come out of the kitchen after my dad left, and they said, this crazy American, he's looking for a village. He was shot down all these years ago, taken prisoner. He said, I know the story. I know the village. So he takes my dad up to the village. And this is the first time there's been any kind of foreigner in that village since 1944, since my dad was there. So all the villagers start coming out of their homes. And there's this group of people in front of him, and he recognizes a face. And she recognizes him. And she comes running out of that crowd and just grabs him. And they just hug each other. And he finds out later that she and the other woman were actually going to be sent to a concentration camp for what they had done. But the cousin who had caught my dad and turned him in had said to the authorities, look, they're just 2 peasant women. They weren't trying to help the enemy. They were just helping somebody that was in need, So they were let go. But it was close. So he was reunited with that woman, and he was later reunited with a woman who had moved from that village into a town, La Spezia, and he got to meet her. So he found her. Unbelievable. Okay. I love that story. The chances are just unfathomable, but they ended up keeping in touch for a long time. I got to meet one of them eventually. Okay, so my own faith and my own sort of, yes, thank you. Yeah, I forgot that detail. Right. So my dad had gone and visited the village, and the woman had only spoke Italian when he went back. Found the village and found the woman. She only spoke Italian, and so they couldn't communicate all that well. So he said to her, "I'm going to come back." He communicated. I'll be back with my wife. So yeah, 2 years later, my dad and my mom went back together, and they hired an interpreter in La Spezia who was going to go with them, spend the day with them, so that they could understand a little bit more about the circumstances. So they got there, and there was one little cafe in town. And so my dad and my mom and the woman had gone into the cafe to get a coffee and chat along with the interpreter. And while they're sitting there, thank you so much for reminding me, while they're sitting there, this man in his 30s comes up and he taps my dad on the shoulder. And through the interpreter, he says, "I remember you." My dad says, he's never seen this guy in his life. He's like, "I don't know you." The guy says, yeah, because of you, I got shot in the back. He had lived. It had been just a superficial wound, fortunately, not anything fatal. I love that story too. Thank you for reminding me of that piece of it. There's so many little tendrils of all these stories that are fabulous. Okay, so all my life, I didn't know the word for it, but I figured out the word for it as an adult. All my life, I have been what they call a third culture kid. Anybody know that term? You don't know that? So, third culture kid is someone whose family of origin is from one culture, but you don't grow up in the culture of your family of origin. You grow up in a different culture. Okay. So, my culture growing up was Brazil, but my family of origin was American. And so, you're never really Brazilian, even though you're like, I was there till I was 14, but you're never really Brazilian. But you're so shaped by Brazil that you're not really American. You have a passport that says US citizen, but you're not really American culturally at all. And so you're this different culture. You're neither culture. You're this third culture kid, right? Well, one of the things about being a third culture kid is that you never have a sense that like this country is the best country or that country is the best country. You never have a sense that this is the right way to think about everything or that is the right way to think about everything. Because part of it is that you're growing up seeing lots of these different points of view that aren't the same, but that are beautiful and that people that you cherish live out. And it's beautiful to see them live it out. And so you're in this funny place of wandering around the world, realizing that like everybody's got their own place they're coming from, And my place isn't normative. It isn't like that against which all others ought to be compared. And that shaped me more deeply than I even knew growing up. But for whatever reason, that then made it so that like as I was encountering people who believed differently from myself about all kinds of things, my attitude couldn't be, well, my way is the right way. That's what I was brought up with, and that's the truth. It just couldn't be that because I just had a different way of looking at the world, that like, the way that I experienced had its depth and its beauty, but how can I say that your way doesn't? Just like it, as an American, how can I say, well, Brazil, they're a third world country, they're not really developed, you live in Brazil for a while, and you're like, whoa, this is a beautiful place. These are beautiful people, So you can't just dismiss because it's different. And so when I was younger, what that meant was that as a Christian, I'd been brought up in the Presbyterian tradition, and I deeply valued it. But I was really interested in other Christian traditions because I thought, you know what? There are probably things in how they live out their Christian faith that are fascinating and that I can learn from. And so I made the choice of going to, when I was in graduate school, I went to a Black Baptist church for a year. I went to an Episcopalian church for 3 years. I went to a Moravian church for a while. And in all these places, it's like, wow, there is so much. I mean, I had never been like in high liturgy, like an Episcopal church before. And everybody always said, oh, prayer's got to be spontaneous to be real prayer. Well, you try to be Episcopalian for a while, and you're going to find out that written down prayers can be super powerful. And they, like, you say them every week, like they get into your heart, you know, that kind of thing. And so, so that sort of young period of my adulthood was fascinating because I started learning about all these Christian traditions. And as a side note, when I was brought here as chaplain, like I was, Presbyterian, PCUSA. I graduated from Princeton. I was all ready to be ordained as a PCUSA pastor and all that. But on the sly, I told everybody, I'm a Bapto-Presbyterian. When I came as chaplain, I came with this, what I would call an ecumenical outlook that was rooted in my Presbyterianism. I mean, I'm very Presbyterian, but not Presbyterian in the way that says Presbyterians are right or Presbyterians are best. In fact, saying Presbyterians are best is not a Presbyterian thing to say anyway, right? And so there was a good kind of mingling of my third cultureness with my Presbyterianness when it came to that. And what I discovered really quickly is that I was not only going to be the chaplain for Presbyterians and Methodists and Episcopalians and Baptists, but I was also going to be the chaplain for Catholic students. And my first semester, have Jewish students show up in my office. And they say, we want to have a Shabbat dinner. And I'm like, yes, fantastic. How do we do that? I'll help you. And then second semester, I have Muslim students show up in my office. And they're like, Ramadan's coming up, and we want to have an Eid feast. And in my head, I'm thinking, I've never heard of Eid. What is that? But I said, great. What do we need to do to make that happen? And all of that came naturally to me as a Christian, like not in spite of me being a Christian, but because of what my parents had helped me understand it means to be a Christian. So I would say that upbringing that I had in some ways goes back to the story about the presence that my father experienced. And that the presence is the thing. It's not about being right about your theology. There's a degree in which, since we're an ecclesia reformata, semper reformanda, I think that none of us have our theology right. We're on the way. We're figuring it out. We're learning more. God is revealing more. And we have to be open to that. And our tradition also is like the whole world is the theater of God's glory. Not just like Presbyterians, not just Christians. It's the whole world. And so can we be generous enough of spirit? In fact, be more like Jesus in listening for what it means to be in God's presence as other people experience that. I always come back to the story of the Good Samaritan. I mean, Jesus' classic story about the Good Samaritan, like he's being asked by a Jewish man what it means to like love God and love your neighbor. And who is your neighbor? And his story is not about a Jewish man doing it well. His story is about somebody of another tradition, another culture doing it well. That's your exemplar. How interesting is that, right? So all of that, I feel like, really had an impact on the incredible journey I got to have as chaplain at Davidson. Because I came here thinking I'm going to work ecumenically. I found out really fast I'm going to work interfaith. And I found out just as fast that it's incredible to work interfaith. It's so rich and beautiful. And students know I don't agree with them theologically. Does that matter in terms of like me being their chaplain? Not a whit. And if it doesn't matter in the sense that like I'm not judging them, I'm not trying to convert them, I'm not trying to make them like, then they trust because they know you care about them and you respect them and you're not expecting them to be like you. Now, it could be that you want to be more like them when you see certain things, and that's like to me that's cool. But you're not going to somehow push them aside if they don't do it your way, think your way. So, so much of it I trace back to my incredible parents, both of them, and the way that they embodied what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, what it means to be a person of faith, and live in this world in which there's so much difference in a way that like sees that difference not ever as a threat, not ever as something that's got to be diminished, but as something that's enriching. And I just so deeply believe that the divine is so much bigger than any of us and any of our traditions. And God is at work in the world, not just in particular ways of thinking or believing. God is at work in the world. And when we say that the world is the theater of God's glory, it doesn't just mean religious stuff in the world is the theater of God's glory. It means everything is, So when my dad is like fashioning an incredible basketball team of Brazilian teenagers at this little school, and he's like helping them learn about what it means to be part of a team, to be a responsible person, to lose well, to win well. Like that's all part of the theater of God's glory, even though there's nothing overtly religious about it, So that's what I ended up sort of carrying with me into my work as chaplain. And man, did I have an amazing journey, 30 years. Incredible students from every tradition, from no tradition, atheist students, humanist students, and then so many different religious traditions. I'm just grateful. Yeah, that's what I am. All right, I'm going to stop there. We got about 5 minutes or so. Any questions or comments or yes, Sterling.
Rolf, how did you come to Davidson
Do you mean as chaplain or as student?
as a student?
As student. So I was living in Winston-Salem, and I was really interested in theater, and I was really interested in writing. And so I wanted to go to a school that emphasized the arts. And in my own weird way, have always been kind of alternative. And I think that goes back to being a third culture kid. I never had to fit in because I wasn't going to fit in. I was never in an inner clique of anything. And so I'm looking for like schools where the arts are like really interesting and schools that have really good academics. And I visit Davidson and I decided it's really not quite the fit for me. And I visit Oberlin, and Oberlin is like the fit for Rob Spach as a high school senior, And so I go to Oberlin. And I'm not going to tell you that whole story. That also shaped my faith in some pretty remarkable ways. I like Oberlin. I have great respect for Oberlin. My experience there was rough for a variety of reasons. And so I decided during that first year at Oberlin that that's not where I wanted to do all 4 years of college. So I rethought what would be a good place for me. And Davidson like completely rose to the top at that point. And so I transferred to Davidson. So that's how I came to Davidson. And, it was in the religion department here with the Dan Rhodeses and, Dr. Max Polly and Dave Kaler, and, that whole group of professors. And then in the English department with people like Tony Abbott, Frank Bliss, that my own sort of academic sensibilities were profoundly shaped And for me, I couldn't separate all my academic interests from my life of faith. Like they had to get integrated. So that's why I did religion and literature as a field, and then went, as John said, I went to UVA and continued pursuing English and some religion courses as well. So that's how I ended up here, and that was kind of my very, very brief articulation of my journey here. Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
How long was your dad a POW?
He was a POW for 11 months total.
11 months.
Yes,
A long 11 months.
that's right. Yeah. Other questions?
Do you think your dad ever felt any guilt about what happened to the village?
That's a really interesting question.
Repeat the question, please, because
Did my father ever feel any guilt about what happened to the villagers from that whole situation? You know, I never heard him express any guilt. But I must say that most of my memories are after he had reunited with the women. And so, like, I didn't get to hear what was going on in his heart so much because I was pretty young. I mean, he reunited with the women when I was 10, you know. So I'm just going to guess. Okay. My guess is no, he didn't feel guilt. He hadn't asked for that to happen. It was just the way things unfolded. He had not in any way wanted anything bad for anybody in that village. He hadn't chosen to go to that village, right? So I don't think he felt guilty, but I do think he felt some grief. But those are very different realities, I would say.
But it had a good outcome.
Sorry.
It had a good outcome.
An incredible outcome. Absolutely. Anything else?
Have you written your memoir?
Well, funny you should ask. I have not written mine. My dad, however, has written an incredible book because, like, these stories are part of this much bigger, amazing narrative. My dad lived an amazing life, and it got translated into Portuguese. So it's out of print, but you can still get it on Amazon if you want to get a copy of it. And they have a copy, I think, in the library of the church that you could also check out. It's a good read. My dad is not a writer, like, you know, professional writer or anything, but he did a really good job with this. And my sister did a great editing job, and together they came up with a really fine, fascinating book. And when you read it, you get a further sense of what I say about how my dad approached things religious. He never like overdoes the religious stuff. Even this incredible experience in the water, like it's like half a page.
But
And
now
yet
you
it's-
need to write yours.
Oh, maybe someday. I didn't have the kind of adventures he had. Man, he had adventures. All right, we got
Rob, this
That's
is,
it?
you know,
Okay. Thank you.
I just want to highlight the importance of sharing with us your story and the value and importance of experiencing God's presence rather than the theology. That's life-changing for us all, so thank you deeply, Rob. Yeah, we would love to read your story. This has been, we've been gifted hearing your story. Thank you.
And let me, this is a friendly addendum to what you just said,
Okay.
okay?
Yeah.
It's not that I think theology doesn't matter. I do think theology matters, but I think it has its place. And it is not in the primary place, okay? But I don't think we should like say it doesn't matter. It does, you know, but we should also, whatever theology we have, we should hold it humbly. Yeah. Thank you so much.
This one.
You guys ever get a chop?
Thank you so much. I'm new today.
I'm so glad you guys did it. I
You know, we talked. It's so deep. That would still be extra here. I'm so glad.
Yeah.
I was in the Peace Corps there for 2 years. Funny. You know where Sosa is? I was about 15 miles from Sosa. Yeah, 2 years in the Peace Corps. And I know what it is to accept a different culture without criticizing. Great job.
Yeah, if you don't get an email. The brain surgeon one, yeah. But, the author is famous. I'm not sure. A different book that I can't really write. I read it for took place in Buddhism in college from a professor who experiences his story, he mentioned very casually, James Mitchell wrote a book called Caravans that is about that broad experience, except it's not, Dr. Jackson is one of the people interviewed for Caravans, but he's not in it, and it's not his story. But it's about, well, it's about history of Afghanistan, but also modern developments. It's very different from almost all of his other books. And it was amazing. I read it probably soon out of college, and it was an amazing book. But more focused on Afghanistan. And I need to reread it now because of these Afghan kids.
You know, I think it's an interesting culture.
Want to look for this. You think we can still get it?
Oh,
And one thing.
When I looked on Amazon, not recently, but like maybe a year ago, I found used copies.
The American culture, you understand. Those people are warriors.
Many of
They're-
them.
Great
I
story.
mean, that is just part of their
Yeah.
culture.
Right.
Remarkable.
Well,
And for somebody in that field, they expect to be.
Really smart.
his Jackson's comments were, that he saw Afghanistan as a teenager,
Did you know my dad? I can't remember.
like American
I
Indian
don't think so.
No, okay.
warrior, like what things in.
Isn't it like Will Terry?
Yeah.
I guess Will.
Your status in society was based upon what kind of a warrior you
Oh, yeah,
were.
absolutely.
54 maybe.
Yeah, absolutely.
See, I didn't come until
Good to start
59.
seeing you again.
Nice to see you.
So I was class of 63. I was here right after John Kirkendall graduated, and he was in the dean's office. And I was struggling, I didn't have any money. I had gotten to the point where I wasn't sure I was going to be able to stay.
Oh, really?
And I went in to talk to him, probably my sophomore year. He loaned me $100.
I'm glad I'm connected to that.
You know, in those days, that's a lot of money.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
he's just a guy out of college, you know,
Yeah.
working at, not getting any money anyway in the dean's office, I'm sure.
Yeah. Wow.
So, you know, we've all been blessed in many ways that we don't realize.
That's right.
What a treat.
Yeah,
Oh, good. I'm so glad
That
you
was
enjoyed it.
just
Hank.
great.
Oh, good. I'm so glad.
Just great. It was a real heartwarming story and
make
in
a
a
great
lot of
movie.
ways. would
Well,
make a
that's
great
what we've
movie.
always said.
Yeah.
Wow.
That war was incredible. But it did lead to some good things, stories.
Yeah.
But I'm sitting there thinking about you and your faith, and then I think of somebody like Donald Trump, and I think, now, what could you tell me that I could see in him or his people that would make me feel any better than I do about those kinds of things? I mean, it's just seems like an eagle in the world to me.
Mhm.
Not all the time. With things like that.
I wonder what his life story is. What shaped him?
I think about that.
Yeah.
I do
And I
think
don't, you know, I have a feeling
that there's some.
that his father was not like my father,
Yeah.
shall we say? You know, and that stuff shapes you. Now you still have, you still have responsibility for the choices you make. Like, I'm not excusing
No,
it,
no, no,
right?
no, no, no.
But I'm also saying
It made him the person he
it does
is.
shape you, and that's undeniable. It doesn't make you, but it shapes you. That's what I would say. So
This is probably something I shouldn't say, but Joe Poteet ruined Bobby's and my relationship with Tommy Clark. On purpose, and also with other people who were close to Tommy. Just took it out. Tommy allowed that to happen. And actually I picked up with Tommy later in life, but it was never like it was. But I've always wondered what his life was like as a child and growing up. Something has happened to him to make him, and I shouldn't have used a personal example, but I have thought about that with Joe.
that's right.
He just doesn't act like he
Yeah.
feels things,
Mhm.
the way the rest of us do or do.
Yeah.
And I wondered if it was a background kind of thing.
Well, you know, I think about the time that I was a student at Davidson and we were all basically Presbyterian oriented, homogeneous, males from the southeast mostly. And I look back, of course, I grew up in the Presbyterian church and my dad was an elder and staunch,
Me too.
but he had some racist tendencies, and I've realized, like you, I think later on, that we're just part of a big picture. We're not the answer necessarily. And it's kind of hard sometimes to, what's the word I want to use? to justify attitudes, that say you've got to do it this way. I think what you've discovered and what you've articulated is how I've sort of become to feel over time. And I worry about, I have a son-in-law, Allison's husband, who was in the military.